It's really been a bloodbath in some areas and just random attacks in others.
The grim reality facing Christians throughout the world, violent and deadly attacks against people of faith. A dive into the contributing factors of international Christian persecution.
It is systemic persecution. It's been going on since 1959, and it's not going to change as long as the Communist Party controls the island.
China's global ambition, threatening our values, our freedom.
Sounding the alarm on the strength of communist regimes on the world stage, the threats they pose for religious liberty, and how we at home can take small steps to limit their power. And
the region's Christians need the spirit of the Abraham Accords, the spirit of pluralism, even more than Muslims and Jews.
A program to reestablish a foothold for Christianity in the birthplace of our faith, as many suffer under the rule of terror. A special episode of EWTN News In Depth starts now.
During the past year, we have seen increased repression by authoritarian governments and the politicized use of blasphemy, apostasy, and conversion laws, including against Christian communities.
The State Department's Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom urges governments to work together to address deteriorating conditions for religious minorities around the world facing a rise in violent attacks. Welcome to a special episode of EWTN News In Depth, focusing on the discrimination and persecution of the faithful around the world. I'm Montse Alvarado. Both the State Department and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, known as USCIRF, issue annual reports on the status of religious freedom across the world and rank countries measuring violations against people of all faiths. Countries of particular concern, or CPCs, are highlighted here in red. Those on the special watch list in yellow are governments the State Department and USCIRF have found allow varying degrees of systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. A few of the biggest violators are China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, Cuba, and Nicaragua. But one country taken off the State Department's list, much to the dismay of many, including USCIRF, was Nigeria, one of the richest countries in Africa and the most populous, with an estimated 219 million people. More than half of that population identifies as Muslim, and about 45% as Christians. Just 10% of those Christians are Catholic. But all Christians have seen an uptick in persecution in the last decade and increased brutality, with regular kidnappings, rapes, and murders. It was just in June of 2022 that gunmen opened fire on worshipers and detonated explosives at a Catholic church. We brought you the images taken just after that attack at St. Francis Catholic Church in southwestern Ondo State in Nigeria. Officials say 40 people died and dozens more were injured, including children. A commissioner at USCIRF has described Nigeria as quickly becoming the killing field for the nation's Christians. Bishop Wilfred Anagbe leads the Diocese of Makurdi, which is almost 300 miles east of that church bombing. He's no stranger to the violence in his country. I spoke with him about the attacks and the state of Christianity there. Here's part of that conversation. Have anti-Catholic tensions in the region been rising?
Not really until probably we can say about a decade ago, when there's been, the issue of Boko Haram came in with their not compliance with the Western education or Western style of life. They attack, and then when they burn their houses, destroy their church places of worship, schools, kill and maim those who survive, run and leave the place, and then they occupy. So it looks like it's a kind of, a systematic agenda of, conquering the territory of the native Nigerians.
And do you believe that this is then what you would call a security crisis for native Nigerians?
Security crisis, yes. But I think the government should have a lot to answer to why this is continuously going on without even being checked. Within the month of March and May, there have been 12 attacks whereby a church packed full with worshippers on Pentecost Sunday. And up till now, the government has not issued any statement whether to the arrest of those people or whatever it is. What kind of a government is that?
So then would you say that
nothing has
Catholics are
improved.
not safe to worship in Nigeria, at least in your
Not
diocese?
just Catholics. I think it's a Christian population, not only Catholics, so to say. Let us be fair.
I have a pastoral question for you, knowing that there's a lot of terror there. Is the faith growing in any way because of the opposition, because of the threats and the violence?
The faith is growing, but then it is, we are like, what let's say, is growing, let's say, in quality, but not, the expansion is not there, because most of the places have been taken over by this group, like in my diocese and some other places. So people can't get back. They are now clustered in those shelters or in those IDP camps, but then they still live their faith. So on that level, the faith is still growing. But in terms of expansion, one, we may not have to build churches in those places. We may not have to put up hospitals or clinics in those areas, because it is very impossible to go through.
Right. It's impossible to share the Christian message. Bishop, we're so grateful for your courage and for taking the time to explain the situation in Nigeria to us, and we hope to continue to shed light on what's going on there, and we'll pray for your safety.
The bishop says he's grateful for prayer, which gives him hope. Catholics in the area are also finding hope through prayer, responding to the attacks with a united appeal to our Blessed Mother.
Help us. Help us. Help us.
Catholic Television of Nigeria broadcast the Chaplet of Our Lady of Perpetual Help a few weeks after the attack in Ondo, a beautiful plea for her intercession to bring an end to the violence and protect them from harm. Nigerian officials say terror groups associated with radical Islam are responsible for the rise in attacks. Leila Gilbert is a senior fellow for international religious freedom at the Family Research Council. She says it's a trend across the continent. Gilbert has traveled extensively in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia for her work, and spoke to me about the persecution of Christians in Africa. Leila, thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion. You know, most people think about the African continent as a block and are really blind to this diversity that I know you're very attuned to. Let's talk about it as zoomed out. Where is Christian persecution most significant in Africa, and where are the safe havens for Christians? What does that dynamic look like, and what is creating this area of persecution?
It's really difficult to talk about areas of safety, although some Christian countries do a better job of preventing attacks. But generally speaking, what's happened there has been a widespread increase of radical Islamist activity. And it's been pretty unchecked by anybody. Most of the world has pulled out. Most of the so-called colonial countries have pulled out of there primarily, and there's not much military response to this. And the countries themselves are both corrupt and ill-prepared for the sophisticated weaponry and so forth that is brought into Africa from the Middle East. So it's really been a bloodbath in some areas and just random attacks in others.
And in discussing the severity of this persecution, the events in Nigeria come to mind most specifically. You've definitely written about the persistent abuse of Christians by radical Islamists. Can you tell us a little bit of the story of Deborah Emmanuel?
Yes, that is one of the most tragic stories we've had in a long time, because this young woman is a Christian student at a university, actually a college, and she was, they were aware of the vulnerability of Christians, and she wrote something on WhatsApp about how Jesus had helped her do well on her exams, and he is the greatest. And she was targeted by a mob of radicals, some from the school. It wasn't clear if they were all students or not. But in a short period of time that morning, after the discussion took place, she was attacked, stoned, and by stoned, I don't think they mean rocks. I mean, they beat her to death with rods and sticks, and then burned her body in the full view of armed so-called protectors that did nothing to intervene. And the story just died out after a few days, but it really epitomizes the incredible violence in Nigeria toward Christians, and based on blasphemy. This was the excuse, that blasphemy is in Islamist law a crime that requires capital punishment. So she was executed for that reason. And this caused an uproar for some time. Even some Muslims spoke out against it, but it died out within a week or so.
And we know blasphemy laws are controversial and important to track, especially at the international level, where people are trying to limit religious violence, but at the same time, it also ends up limiting free speech. So it's an important issue for us to track. But I do think that it's important to say her name, Deborah Emmanuel, so that people know her story and look her up. The State Department added and then dropped Nigeria over the course of 2 administrations as a country of particular concern, a CPC. Why does this designation matter or make a difference in the international sphere?
Well, it should make a difference because it makes it possible to apply sanctions to leadership in those countries and to take legal measures that aren't normally taken. I can't say it always works that way, but it has helped. But the strangest thing about Nigeria was that after Secretary of State Pompeo declared it, as soon as the Biden administration came in, within days, it was removed without explanation. And it is one of the most vicious countries in the world. It should have been done years before, but it was completely removed. And to this day, we have no explanation, except that the official position of our State Department is that all of this is due to climate change. And so therefore, it's not a religious issue, and therefore it can't be handled in that same way, which is almost, the word is preposterous, but that is the position of our government at this time.
Well, we know well that these are religious issues, and you've covered Uganda, Kenya, Somalia, and Burkina Faso, just to name a few places that you've called out where converts to Christianity from Islam are not safe because of extremists and terrorist organizations. What role, then, can governments play in protecting people of faith?
Well, governments have different views of these things. Some take different positions. The Nigerian government is clearly, if not complicit in what's going on there, at least turning a blind eye, but most of us think they're involved. But country by country, some countries are Christian, and they do make some effort to arrest the violators. Others just turn a blind eye. It depends on the demographics of the country and on the leadership. The West is not involved, and there is a tremendous bloodbath going on across Africa because of ISIS and the engagement of some of these radical groups with ISIS still centered in Iraq. So this is not being talked about much, but there's a clear line across the continent where this is taking place. Governments don't have a responsibility there, so they don't do much. And all we can do is continue to report the bloodshed and how, as humans and as Christians, we have a responsibility to our people and to all who suffer unjust persecution.
And Leila, is there anything that we can do as individuals, aside from reporting and staying informed? What can we do to stop the massacre?
I would like to see Christians informing their churches about these things. I'm not sure that churches generally across America are aware of what our brothers and sisters are experiencing in Africa and in other countries. And I think in the prayers that take place in the church, in activities in the church, these things need to be talked about and reported and kept up with. And it gets lost in all the other issues that we're concerned about. I'd like to see churches more involved, pastors more involved, and prayer groups involved in caring about this and spreading the word about what's going on.
We know that the Catholic Church is growing in Africa. Is there anything that the Catholic Church is doing or should do to advocate for these individuals?
The Catholic Church is doing a very good job. They are much more organized. You are organized and global. And I see a lot more response to the Catholic Church than I do to these smaller Protestant denominations that aren't always cooperating with each other. So I congratulate the Catholic Church. Yes, more could be done. Always more could be done in so many places. But it needs coordination and it needs cooperation. The subject itself requires that, and it doesn't always happen.
Well, we feel the pressure and the urgency to make sure that we talk about these issues. Thank you so much, Leila.
Thank you.
The Catholic Church has worked for peace in Nigeria, as well as provided much-needed resources to Nigerians with the help of the pontifical charity Aid to the Church in Need and organizations like Caritas and Catholic Relief Services. Pope Francis was scheduled to visit 2 countries in Africa at the beginning of July, but had to cancel due to health-related issues related to his knee. Unable to travel to Congo, he greeted the Congolese community in Rome. The Holy Father has been outspoken whenever violence or suffering has occurred on the continent, calling for peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo, urging humanitarian aid in Ethiopia, asking for constructive collaboration in post-apartheid South Africa, and expressing his closeness to the faithful after the deadly attacks in Nigeria. Some say the future of the priesthood might very well lie with the success or failure of Catholicism in Nigeria. The country is home to 20 million Catholics, which accounts for about 10% of the population, but it's also home to the world's largest Catholic seminary. More than 800 seminarians attend Bigard Memorial Seminary. The thriving college is found in the southeastern part of Nigeria in Enugu State. Originally founded in the early 1900s, for 100 years it has been a much-needed beacon of hope for men starting their journey to the priesthood. Our special coverage of Christian persecution continues after the break with a look at the controversial agreement made by the Holy See with leaders in communist China, how it's impacting the church. We'll be right back.
It isn't enough for Christians to merely worship in their churches. What they need is to live as respected and contributing members of society without fear of retribution.
An initiative to keep Christians safe and flourishing in the Near East. We speak with the founder of the project designed to strengthen interreligious dialogue. That's still to come. But first,
forcing our governments to do more to stop this genocide that is in its year 6.
A call to action to stop the communist regime in China from the massacre and enslaved labor of its people. What you can do here in the U.S. to help stop these atrocities.
China has faced international condemnation for the alleged persecution of its citizens, particularly those of faith. The U.S., the European Union, and other countries accuse the Chinese Communist Party, also called the CCP, of genocide, rape, forced abortions and sterilizations, forced labor and re-education camps, and more. Welcome back to our special broadcast on Christian persecution around the globe. While we've chosen to focus on Christians, Catholic Church teaching on religious freedom acknowledges the importance of religious freedom for all. And the persecution of other faiths in China is so severe, it must be covered. Particularly the Uyghur Muslims. The U.S. and allies say this religious minority is suffering in mass imprisonment detention centers in northwest China. And the United Nations says more than 1 million Uyghurs are dead or missing in what has been compared to the Jewish Holocaust. The U.S. and several countries have issued stiff sanctions against several Chinese officials. The Chinese government has called the charges lies and disinformation. The Vatican has walked a fine line in its relationship with China. In 2018, the Holy See and China signed an agreement allowing the CCP to nominate bishops for the Pope's approval, giving both sides a say over church leadership. And bishops who had been installed without papal mandate were brought back into full communion with Rome through the agreement. Pope Francis defended the policy, saying, faced with a closed situation, one must seek the possible, not the ideal path. Diplomacy is the art of the possible and making what is possible become a reality. But while the Vatican seems to be negotiating through difficult issues with the CCP, the former Bishop of Hong Kong has publicly criticized the agreement, as well as the CCP. Cardinal Joseph Zen accuses the Holy See of closing both eyes on the injustices of the Communist Party. In May, the over 90-year-old cardinal was arrested, charged with 4 other democracy advocates, sparking international outcry. Hong Kong authorities say his crime was failing to register a pro-democracy association. The CCP has also targeted another prominent Catholic in China, media tycoon Jimmy Lai, who owned the last democratic newspaper in Hong Kong, The Apple Daily, is accused of helping a pro-democracy activist flee to Taiwan and colluding to organize unauthorized protests, among other alleged offenses. He's currently serving a 13-month prison sentence. While the Vatican agreement with the CCP is controversial, the Holy See has also initiated May 24th as the World Day of Prayer for the Church in China. Pope Francis this year asked Catholics to join him in praying for the faithful in China. Any religion is seen as a threat to loyalties to the communist regime. A man familiar with the regime's tactics is the chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, Nuri Turkel. He shared his expertise on what we can do to limit China's power. Thank you so much again for joining us, Nuri. It's wonderful to have you here, especially because we can talk about your book, No Escape, the true story of China's genocide of the Uyghurs. It focuses on the persecution of one group, the Uyghur Muslim community, of which you are a member. Can you tell us about this progression of what you have named a genocide in China?
The Chinese Communist Party has always been viewed any type of religion, specifically so-called foreign religion, namely Christianity and Islam, as a sign of disloyalty or could be potential source for unrest, opposition, because the religious belief, the Abrahamic religion in particular, teaches the values, love and affection, forgiveness, and those are kind of things are not in the Communist Party teaching. So essentially, Communist Party ideology and religious belief are incompatible. The Chinese government has figured that out a long time ago, and that's why they have been using the terms such as they have figured out how to deal with the religious believers with the slogan, constant battle against the Western influence. To the Chinese state, Communist Party, Western influence is essentially a religious belief, because they do know that religious belief, specifically Christianity and others, can be very attractive because it comes with freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and eventually that will create another group that could pose ideological threat to the state. But they don't say it specifically, but China has been on war with religion for a long time, except for a handful of traditional religion that have been forcibly loyal to the state. But when it comes to Christianity and Islam in particular, they are rewriting the script. They are doing something called a synicization of the religion, essentially creating a new type of textbooks, which is not a religion, as you know and I know.
Well, let's talk about what you talk about, the Western influence. How about the Roman influence or the Roman Catholic influence? How were Catholics treated in China and the Catholic Church?
The treatment of the Catholics in China is disturbingly going to the direction that deserves calls for global condemnation. China's Communist Party, despite the fact having a good relationship with the Vatican, making all those promises, allowing bishops to be appointed, not fulfilling its bilateral agreement with the Vatican. At the same time, Vatican has not been vocal. Vatican should know that this is the regime could lock up 93-year-old Cardinal.
Cardinal Zen, yes.
Yes, and they also locked up Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong.
Yes.
Their group of Christians, Catholics in China has been persecuted. This deserves condemnation, and this the ongoing quote-unquote dialogue with the Chinese, trying to find a common ground to work this out, is not working. The Catholic Church all around the world needs to revisit their approach to communist China.
It's an important approach that you've also denounced companies for in their sponsorship of events in China. Is there something that you recommend individual citizens can do?
The companies, global business around the world have managed to make all of us, global consumers, complicit in the ongoing genocide against Uyghurs and ongoing religious persecution against vulnerable religious and ethnic groups in China. We got to tell them, we need to find a way to tell them, no, not in my name. The way to do it is consumer activism. It's very basic. We have legal tools, legislative mandate have been put in place. Since June 21, United States government has implemented Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act,
yes,
which perhaps arguably the most effective legal tool that Congress put in place since China joined the WTO. This has to be a global effort. This has to be intergovernmental effort, either conducted bilaterally or multilaterally. We are not supposed to allow communist China polluting global supply chain with slave-made products. More than 80 brands, global brands, That includes companies that make solar panels. The environmentalists should know that those solar panels are made by dirty gold and enslaved human beings. So global consumer activism, we can start from our homeland. The Americans should be mindful that the products that they're buying from department stores, Costco, anywhere, Target, Walmart, even computer components, even the PPEs that we've been using to save lives, have been made by enslaved Uyghurs. And we should say no to them, no to the business owners, no to the investors, no to those companies that have been dancing with the Chinese to enable the Chinese government to continue to persecute religious groups in China.
An important call to action. Nuri, there's another very disturbing trend that we're seeing again, which is organ trafficking or harvesting. That's come up in the news, particularly taken from prisoners in China. What can you tell us about this situation?
The organ harvesting has been a practice, has been used as a tool by the Chinese government to repress, persecute religious minorities. That started with the Falun Gong practitioners. Now it's becoming a political economy. A few years ago, they even used one of their hospitals, world-class hospitals, with equipment, a comfortable room, well-educated doctors, promoting this halal organ marketing idea. And they interviewed people in the hospitals speaking Arabic, apparently, that they're very pleased that the wait time is extremely short. For any organ transplant in the United States takes months, years, but in China it's as short as 48 hours in some instances. This should give us a pause when we hear about China promoting this idea that they have medical tourism.
Yes.
And also recently a peer-reviewed article been published by an Australian expert and Israeli expert that the doctors in China has been helping the Chinese state to commercialize human organs. I think it's despicable, it's unconscionable, deserves worldwide condemnation. Not only that, the United States government should look into the possibility of going after those doctors. They should not be engaging in medical research with our medical schools. We should not allow them to even come to the United States because this is so inhuman. And they are targeting vulnerable people who cannot protect themselves in communist China.
An international humanitarian crisis. Nuri, we're so grateful for your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on.
More of our interview with Nuri can be found on our social media. We invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to hear more about Nuri's book, No Escape. The communist regime of China is not the only country in Asia that has violated the universal right to religious freedom. USERV's report also highlights North Korea, Russia, India, Vietnam, and Burma, as well as Malaysia and Indonesia as countries of particular concern or to be placed on the special watch list.
If you don't register, you're on the target list of the Office of Religious Affairs.
Still to come on EWTN News In Depth, a crackdown on religious liberty in Cuba, expert analysis of the disregard and disrespect for religion in the island nation.
If there is a hope for Christianity in this region at this point, it is in Lebanon.
A mission to combat the declining presence of Christians in the Near East, the birthplace of Christianity. Stay with us.
Native Christian communities are smaller, weaker, and more despondent than ever before. It wasn't always this way. Once upon a time, the Near East was overwhelmingly filled with Christians. But 15 centuries of social, cultural, political change saw these populations gradually decline so that only isolated pockets remain today.
In a constantly shifting region, many Christians have left the geographic cradle of Christianity, the Near East. Despite being home to some of the oldest Catholic and Christian traditions, millions of Christians are displaced, imprisoned, and even killed. As we continue our conversation on Christian persecution, we focus now on the birthplace of our faith, the challenges Christians face, and an initiative to help strengthen their physical security, economic prosperity, and cultural resilience. 8 countries in this region are considered countries of particular concern, according to USERV, for violations of religious freedom, including Iran, Syria, and Afghanistan. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, which allowed the Taliban to seize power, left the estimated 10,000 Christians in a life-threatening situation and women hanging in the balance. Some were lucky enough to safely evacuate the country, while others live in hiding, fearing for their lives. The Taliban operates under strict Islamic law that does not tolerate other religions. Christians, Jews, and other minorities struggle for equality in Muslim-majority countries. But in Lebanon, there's a small refuge of coexistence between Christians and Muslims. Lebanon is home to thousands of Christians who fled neighboring war-torn Syria. The hope of our next guest is to expand those areas of coexistence as well as expand the Christian presence in these regions. Robert Nicholson, founder, president, and executive director of the Philos Project, joins us now to explain a new project, Abraham's Missing Child. It aims to bring sustainable peace to the Middle East. So then what is the Abraham's Missing Child initiative, and what do you hope to accomplish with it?
The Abraham's Missing Child initiative is our attempt to leverage changing regional dynamics for the benefit of the region's indigenous Christian communities. And when I say changing regional dynamics, I am talking about a revolutionary moment that's happened in the Near and Middle East in the last 2 years that has kind of flown under the radar for most people. The most iconic expression of this change is what's called the Abraham Accords, were a series of agreements, basically peace agreements, between the state of Israel, the world's only Jewish state, and 4 Arab states around the region. Now, of course, Israel already had a peace treaty with Egypt, a peace treaty with Jordan, but these peace treaties, which came online in late 2020, were different in that they strove for a kind of warm peace. This was an effort on the part of Arabs and Israelis, not just to not kill each other, but to actually work toward a positive future, recognizing that difference is okay and that different people can share this region together. Now, I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal last year where I said, this is great. Muslims and Jews recognizing that bygones can be bygones, that a future can be had. I love it. But if these are Abraham Accords, what about the other child of Abraham, right? The 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Christianity is missing. And arguably, the region's Christians need the spirit of the Abraham Accords, the spirit of pluralism, even more than Muslims and Jews. So what can be done about that? How can we channel that momentum toward the Christian communities? The Abraham's Missing Child Initiative is our attempt to do that. 3 events over the next year, bringing Jews, Christians, and Muslims together to come up with tangible recommendations for Christians with countries with Christian minority populations to implement in law and in governance affirmative action, let's say, for Christians who are suffering, in some places more than others.
That's an important move. Well, let's talk about this one place that seems to be very special. We spoke to Maronite Bishop Gregory Mansour on Lebanon's unique position in the Middle East. Let's take a listen.
In Muslim-majority countries, Jewish citizens, Christian citizens are often seen as second-class citizens. And in most of those countries, they have fled. Just Lebanon is left.
Robert, do you consider Lebanon to be a safe haven for Christianity? What threatens religious freedom there?
Lebanon has been the closest thing, I sometimes say, to a Christian country in the Near and Middle East. And of course, it's not a Christian country, but constitutionally, the president of Lebanon needs to be a Christian. And that's because historically, the country has had a very large percentage of Christians. Although Egypt has a larger number in about 8 to 10 million, Lebanon has always had a much larger percentage of Christians, somewhere 30, 40, at times 50%. And that's meant that the country's culture, the country's society has very much embodied a kind of Christian sensibility, right? And Christians are very upwardly mobile. They occupy very important positions in every sector of public life. And that's different than what we see throughout the Arab and Islamic world. So Sayyidina, the Bishop Gregory, is absolutely right. Lebanon is a safe haven for Christianity, but I would qualify it by saying that it kind of used to be. These days, all bets are off. What's happened is an outside power, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has taken the country of Lebanon hostage through a proxy militia, Hezbollah, which has worked its way into government and maintains vast armaments all around the country, preventing any attempt by Christians or anyone else from breaking this Iranian deadlock on the nation. And what we're seeing, and what Bishop Gregory and I and others are talking about, is the death of that free Christianity in Lebanon on our watch. I mean, if there is a hope for Christianity in this region at this point, it is in Lebanon. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is a slow death of that community as the Christians emigrate and are effectively powerless to get their country back on track.
Well, Pope Francis has tried to do something in this region, and he took a historic trip to Iraq last year, the first pope to make it to Iraq, to improve relations with Shiite Muslims and bring hope to his persecuted flock and try to do something just as you are. Do you believe his visit accomplished anything?
I think it accomplished a lot. And you know, messages are in some ways even more important than initiatives, right? The perception is just as important in this region as probably in others as reality. And what the Pope did in visiting Iraq, in visiting the city of the birthplace of Abraham, the patriarch of these three religions, is to give his approval, his imprimatur, in a sense, to this Abrahamic move that calls for mutual respect amid difference, right? Which is the spiritual foundation of this Abrahamic axis that's emerging, this Arab-Israeli cooperation. And I think that it cleared the way in the eyes and the minds of many of the region's Christians to join this movement and to not be afraid to affiliate themselves with a new look of diversity, right? To be able to say that we can be different and to live in this region, and to feel that the world, or in this particular case, the Catholic Church, is behind them. I think it was huge. It was a watershed event. And really what we're doing now is trying to harvest really the fruit that he's planted.
Well, it's one that we covered extensively. Thank you so much, Robert, for your work, and we pray for your safety.
Thank you.
That's why the Catholic Church is so hated by the government of Daniel Ortega, because the Catholic Church is going to say this is wrong, what you're doing is wrong.
Next, our attention turns to Latin America, our focus Nicaragua, where religious persecution is rampant. Even the missionaries of charity Mother Teresa's order were recently kicked out of the country despite their good works and dedication to the poor. We'll explain in a moment.
In the minds of many, Catholicism is widely embraced throughout Latin America. That understanding is steeped in the rich Catholic history throughout countries like Mexico, Brazil, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. But the faithful have faced great challenges and persecution in many countries south of the U.S. border. In Mexico, the Catholic Church was actually outlawed for more than 70 years. It was a time known as the Cristero War. Between 1940 and 1992, the church was not allowed to own property, run schools, convents, or monasteries, have more than a certain number of priests, or defend itself in the courts. In Colombia, while there's a high percentage of Christians, believers face persecution from criminal gangs, armed guerrillas, paramilitary forces, and indigenous groups. Many church leaders face harassment, extortion, and death when they denounce cartels and defend human rights. In Nicaragua, the persecution of Catholics is making headlines after a world-famous Catholic religious order was forced out and brought to Costa Rica. Priests were exiled and Catholic television programming was shut down. In less than 4 years, the Catholic Church in Nicaragua has been the target of 190 attacks and desecrations, including a fire in the Managua Cathedral. Much of the violence stems from the church's support of peaceful demonstrators during the 2018 protests after the government's campaign became forceful and violent. Those protests were sparked after reforms decreed by President Daniel Ortega increased taxes and decreased benefits. Monsignor Silvio Jose Baez was one of several bishops who was assaulted by a pro-government group. These pictures of his injuries were posted on his Twitter page in 2018. The clergy were trying to protect demonstrators who had taken refuge in a basilica. Our EWTN sister news organization, Así Prensa, has done extensive coverage of religious persecution in Latin American countries, including Nicaragua. I recently spoke to its editor-in-chief, David Ramos. David, thank you so much for joining us. What is the most significant thing about the history of religion in Nicaragua? I know the Catholic influence there dates back to the 1500s, but has it always been a majority there?
Yeah, first, thank you for inviting me.
Of course.
Yeah, we could say that in general, Nicaragua is mostly Catholic. It has a long story, a long history of being Catholic since being evangelized by the Spanish crown.
Right.
So there's a really big influence of the Catholic Church through the history of Nicaragua. But this kind of breaks of has some kind of problems, if you like, since the Sandinista revolution, right, in the 60s, 70s, because the Sandinista guerrilla was kind of a leftist, a Marxist guerrilla, so they had this feeling against the Catholic Church, the religion in general. So they were against it, kind of. So Daniel Ortega is a member of the Sandinistas,
right?
Yeah. So there we can find some kind of why this is happening in Nicaragua right now, because this is the thinking of these people. I can go to church, I can pray. There's not exactly a persecution, but if I say anything when I am in public, from my faith perspective, against the government, against Daniel Ortega, it started to be complicated.
Starts to become uncomfortable. Well, let's talk about something specific. A bishop in Costa Rica had to take in the missionaries of charity after they were kicked out of Nicaragua by the National Assembly. That's Nicaragua's legislative body. This is a video of that moment that we're showing right now. Do you think that we will see more of this kind of exclusion of Catholicism and orders that are inspired by their Catholic belief? Do you think that we'll see that that actually manifest itself in more expulsions of Catholic orders or groups?
Sadly, yes. We're going to see more of this. This is not the first time. We reported about an investigation from a lawyer, from a Nicaraguan lawyer, that's been counting over 190 aggressions in the last 2.5 years. No, 3 years, almost 3 years. So this is kind of something that we're gonna get used to, maybe, to see from Nicaragua, because they're persecuting. They have no respect for priests, for bishops, for no one. And when you don't have any respect for a cardinal, for a bishop, then you have no respect for the lay people. So we are watching. We can see right now how priests are persecuted through the police, through forces, paramilitary forces related to the government. So this is going to go on, and probably this is going to get worse. We have news from seminaries that are being persecuted by the government, and we have, well, you can find that we have bishops in Nicaragua that had to leave the country so they won't be killed. We have these people that criticize the government for justice, not for wanting just criticize, but they just want justice and freedom of religion, and they get persecuted for that.
Right.
So that's what happened with a lot of these people, and with the missionaries of charity. They just help people. They just help poor people. They don't do politics. They don't get into politics. They don't criticize the government, and they, innocent as they are, they got expelled from Nicaragua.
It's incredible. Mother Teresa's tradition is one of peace and, as you were saying, a very apolitical approach to serving anyone and everyone. You were talking about freedom of religion and the way that that's changed. Nicaragua's constitution does protect religious freedom, and it's written in the constitution that it's supposed to also encourage the expansion of the Christian message. But the State Department recently denounced religious freedom violations there. This is something new and has been escalating over time. You were talking about how we will see more of this under President Ortega. Is this only affecting the Catholic Church? Is this affecting others?
It is affecting others, but mainly the Catholic Church, because we as Catholics know that we have a kind of organized body in the church. We have a hierarchy. So you can find easily who's the head of this parish, who's the head of this diocese. So that's why, and we have to understand too that the Catholic Church is prophetic. So the Catholic Church is used to say this is unfair, this is not good, this is work from the evil, but. And that's why the Catholic Church is so hated by the government of Daniel Ortega, because the Catholic Church is going to say this is wrong, what you're doing is wrong. And Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, his wife, they really hate somebody tells them what's wrong. They think they are in the right place.
Our thanks to David Ramos, editor-in-chief of Así Prensa. Next, we turn to Cuba, notorious for stamping out religious freedom. We're joined in studio by an expert very familiar with the give and take between the Cuban government and its people. We'll be right back. A year after the largest protests in decades in Cuba shook the island's Communist Party government, little has changed. Protesters filled the streets, then expressing their frustration with food, medicine, and gas shortages. The economic and political factors that caused the unrest largely remain today, with massive gas shortages forcing people to wait for days to fill their tanks, and hundreds of people who participated in the protests still imprisoned. Cuba is on USCIRF's special watch list as religious freedom remains highly restricted. According to its annual report, the government continues to use surveillance, harassment, and ad hoc interpretations of legislation to suppress religious freedom and persecute advocates of religious liberty. We're fortunate to have Jason Poblete joining us. He's an expert on conditions in Cuba. Jason is the president of the Global Liberty Alliance and practices international and domestic law. He has helped free unlawfully detained Americans in several countries around the world. Jason, it's so great to have you here with us. Thank you for talking to us about this very special island nation. What is the history of religious freedom in Cuba? What can you do there as a church?
Well, thanks, Montse, for doing this special. It's been phenomenal. And in Cuba, just 90 miles away, I mean, persecution, religious freedom is a myth in Cuba. It's elusive. It has been since 1959. And the Communist Party in Cuba that controls pretty much all of civil society, once you step out of line, especially if you're a person of faith, you're bringing yourself within the eyes of the Communist Party, and that's problematic. So since 1959 and the 60s, and today it's been institutionalized, it's systemic, the persecution in Cuba. So I think it's something that we see on TV sometimes, these images of freedom and religious leaders maybe speaking with government officials, but that's a myth. There is no religious freedom in Cuba, and it's under the control of the Communist Party, and there's a special office. We call it the Stasi, the Cuban version of the East German Stasi, the religion police, that frankly we've been advocating for sanctioning for several years now. We hope that this administration will do it. The prior one didn't do it, although we made some strides. I think you need to rein that in, especially in the Western Hemisphere, because it's not just Cuba. That type of political persecution and religious persecution has spread to other countries with the help of Cuba, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, and in other countries where even in the democratic nations, the attack on the church is ongoing, and it's happening throughout the Americas. And Cuba is right at the heart of it. Freedom of religion is illusory in Cuba. They're trying to squeeze it out of society. And the Catholic Church, by the way, is the only thing standing. So Pope John Paul started this process in 1998. He spoke about freedom in just about every single stop he made on the island. That spirit is still alive in Cuba, but they are coming under a lot of assault, especially after these uprisings last year. So we're seeing priests attack, which hadn't happened in a few years directly. Now it's happening directly.
John Paul II played a really pivotal role in kind of reopening religious practice on the island, where people don't realize that for many, many years, decades, Christmas couldn't be celebrated. Public celebrations of Christmas were not allowed in Cuba. And when John Paul II, now a saint, went there, he transformed things. But as much as they've changed, they've also, like you said, stayed the same. Different administrations have taken different approaches. The Obama administration allowed people to go in through religious visas. Right. The Trump administration changed the rules a little bit, and then the Biden administration just opened up for families to be able to send money again, saying that that money will never go to anti-democracy actors, which I find suspicious and hard to control. Does that actually have an impact on the people on the island?
That's a touchy subject in the diaspora community, for example, with Cuban exiles, and there's a lot of division within the communities about how to handle that. Because on the one hand, you want to, how can you turn your back on a loved one?
That's right.
There's a lot of hunger, a lot of suffering in Cuba. On the other hand, it's a pipeline that's also been used by the regime to prop up an economy that's roughly between $6 to $8 billion a year that flows from here to there. The law is designed a certain way, our laws. It's designed to do both. However, through decades of either political maneuvering on the good or the bad, depending on the side, let's take politics out of it, we've allowed it to become, it's been abused by the system in Cuba. Right. And now these billions go in for things other than humanitarian relief. On top of that, this administration has allowed the Cuban regime to control how some of the humanitarian aid is distributed. That's what we are opposed to. No matter who's a Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter to us. This has to go directly to the people.
Right.
And that is not what's happening. So the Catholic Church in Cuba has played a constructive role in that as best they can to at least separate the politics from the aid.
The aid flow through the church.
They're trying, but it's not easy. And it takes a lot of patience to do anything in Cuba, just to get a pallet of food in Cuba, just a crate, not a container, just a pallet.
No, yeah.
It's controlled.
Standing in line to get milk is a regular thing for many people. Talk to me very quickly about political prisoners.
Yes.
A lot of people think that the illusion of that has gone away, that people aren't arrested anymore, that we don't have these conversations about political prisoners in Cuba, but the regime still has and continues to imprison people.
That's been happening since 1959, and it's not going to stop. So July 11th, the latest uprisings last year, I call it, unfortunately, a new generation of civil society activists and political prisoners, because it's gone in waves now. Some of the older generations passing, but now there's a new generation that's never been exposed to this.
Right. Some
of these people are Catholics, practicing Catholics, some of them have no religious background. What's unique about this is that they're learning kind of through the school of hard knocks, right? They're in there receiving the blows psychologically and physically and are being locked up for it. And there's reawakening about, wait a minute, what's all this about? Why is this happening? So it's been happening since '59. It's systemic. As far as the church goes, the Office of Religious Affairs, with the intelligence services, is in charge of going after the Christians, and that's what they do. And it's kind of almost ghoulish. The party is now taking social issues that they know divide Christians, and like abortion, like LGBT issues, and using it as a wedge issue.
Mm-hmm.
They don't
to create division.
Yeah. So in other words, they're dehumanizing a group of people to create division within the religious community. Because that's what they're doing. They claim to be supporting the rights of minorities. No, they're using that, and they're creating new political prisoners. And unfortunate, I think it's going to continue. There'll be more spikes, and I believe in more political prisoners. And the only way out of this, Montse, I believe, is to tighten a little bit and enforce U.S. law the way Congress intended, and work with our Christian and other communities, faith communities out there, to make sure that we're getting help to the people, but not to the regime. That, I think, is a key part of what's missing right now in our policy.
I think that's been the theme throughout all of the advocates that we've spoken to in the international space for this special discussing Christian persecution, is tightening what it is that we do when we engage in the international space. Thank you so much, Jason. In honor of all those Christians who've been persecuted or killed for the faith, we ask that you pray the prayer for persecuted Christians. Look out for links to the prayer on our social media channels, and be sure to follow us and take a moment to remember those who don't enjoy the freedoms we cherish here in the U.S. Thank you for joining us for this special broadcast. Be sure to tune in next week, same time, same place, for more news important to your Catholic life.